you all for being here, and thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. I have been presenting this talk all over North America, but this is the first time I've been presenting to an audience in Europe, so that's exciting for me too. And I see that there's one person online from BC, so I also have some other Canadians on the call, which is fun. So I wanted to start by saying that this presentation focuses on how to assess health risks in rare earth element mining that are unique to rare earth element mining. And because they're unique, they don't really have comprehensive guidance or legislation because it's an emerging industry outside of China. So there's not a lot of guidance, legislation, and so this presentation shows what research has been done in the past and what professional judgment can be applied in order to assess worker health risks in the industry. So all of the work that WSP Golder has done in this industry so far has been confidential, so I'm not going to show you any data or anything, but we have been starting to see quite a few requests come in from mining and processing of rare earth elements. So I'm hoping to deliver an interesting presentation on this. So this is the agenda. I'm first going to talk a little bit about what rare earth elements are, and then go over what the mining industry looks like globally at the moment. And then I'm going to look at the risk to worker health, and I'm going to focus on two main unique hazards, and that's the rare earth element particulate themselves, and as Colin was mentioning, some of the ionizing radiation risks that comes from how rare earth elements co-occur with uranium and thorium deposits. And then I'm going to jump into legislation and guidance, and I'm going to forewarn you that I don't have a lot of experience with legislation and guidance in the UK, but I think a lot of it is global, and a lot of the lessons can be applied to the legislation and guidance that are likely in the UK right now. And then I'm going to leave you with a few future considerations that specifically have to do with how all of this ties back to worker health considerations and what we can do going forward to make sure that workers' health is not compromised by this new and emerging industry without a lot of research done in the area. Okay, so first an overview of rare earth elements and the industry globally. So whenever I say rare earth elements, I'm not sure if everyone is familiar exactly with what they are. So whenever I say rare earth elements, I mean these 17 elements on the periodic table. So I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but the ones down at the bottom are referred to as the lanthanides, and then scandium and yttrium over on the left are added in with them because they have similar chemical and physical properties, and they're found in the same ore bodies. So whenever I say rare earth elements, this is specifically what I mean. And they can be further subdivided into heavy and light rare earth elements. And this will be a term that some of you probably have come across already. And that's because the heavy rare earth elements are the ones that are more rare, and China has almost a complete monopoly on these ones, so you'll be seeing that governments are really interested in developing their supply chain of heavy rare earth elements. And so what are they used for? They're used for a variety of things, but their single highest end use are permanent magnets, or really strong magnets. So these magnets are found in green technologies, so the magnets in wind turbines, they're found in electric vehicles, they're found actually also in your smartphone, microphone, speakers. And some other uses that are of importance right now too are in defense, so they're used for the laser systems in missiles. So there's lots of different applications for them, and specifically defense and green technologies are the ones that governments are very interested in securing domestic supply chain for right now. So where are they being produced? This is a graph of the world rare earth element production from 2011 to 2020. And the top line here is the production outside of China, in China, and then the orange one down on the bottom is the rest of the world. So really what we can take away from this is that China still holds the largest part of the market and a very significant part. So because of that, you might have seen recently that a lot of Western governments are adding rare earth elements to their strategic minerals list and strategy, and for the green technology and low carbon initiatives, and also for defense. And that's the case for the US, Canada, Australia, and the UK, and likely others. I also wanted to give everyone a sense of where the mining and exploration projects are now. And so this is a map of the world showing all of the active mines. They're the ones with the solid circles and the advanced projects. So you can see that the majority of the active mines are over in China. There's a few, one in Australia, South Africa, Brazil, Russia, but majority are in China. And then there's a lot of advanced exploration projects, especially in North America. So that's where we're seeing a lot of our requests for assessments at the moment. So when I did a little bit of research on the UK and rare earth elements, I came up with, they're part of the UK's critical mineral strategy. So that document there on the left, there's certainly initiatives within the UK to support the supply chain within the UK and UK's partners worldwide. And they have just recently opened a processing facility of rare earth elements near Hull. And so that's the picture on the right there. So these are some of the things that you might be coming up against in the near future, or already are. Okay, so on to the risks to worker health. And as I said, I'm going to focus on two of the unique hazards. So in this next figure here, the two unique hazards are number 1 and 2. However, all of these are hazards that you would encounter on a rare earth element mining site, and ones that you'll need to include in a baseline assessment of worker health. So the first one is rare earth element particulates, so the elements themselves. And really the takeaway is that there's limited research on the health effects, and we'll go into that a little bit more deeper in the next coming slides. And the second one is naturally occurring radioactive materials, or what I'm going to call norms from now on. And it's not so much the rare earth elements themselves, it's actually the thorium and uranium that co-occur in the mineral deposits. And we know that these cause ionizing radiation, which is a human carcinogen. And I'll touch a little bit more later on as to why these are unique. You might be asking, okay, this is not all that unique. We have uranium mining, but I'll get into that later. And then the last two are ubiquitous hazards on a mining site: noise, causing noise-induced hearing loss, and then crystalline silica dust, which is a human carcinogen and causes lung cancer. And there could be a host of other health hazards on mining sites. So whenever assessments are done on site, you will have to take into consideration, for example, whole body vibration from operating machinery, heavy machinery, and thermal stressors. So in Canada, cold stress is certainly a big issue, especially up in the north here. And then there could be other different contaminants that co-occur in the mineral deposit. So for example, naturally occurring asbestos could be in the ore and could subsequently be a health hazard. You might have other metals such as lead and arsenic, and also fluorides, and those can all contribute to health hazards for the workers on site. So in the next few slides, I'm going to go into a little bit more on the risks of rare earth element particulate exposure. So really the takeaway here is that the research is limited on how rare earth elements affect the human body. There is some toxicity data, but a lot of it is on conducted on laboratory animals, so controlled experiments or laboratory tests. There is some human data that exists, but it's mainly case reports of disease in different industries and geographical studies of people in China living near mining operations. So the takeaway here is that the lack of epidemiological studies of occupational exposure really creates a knowledge gap with respect to the possible long-term health effects of rare earth element exposure in mining and processing. And this translates, as you'll see later, into the lack of legislation and guidance, specifically as it relates to occupational exposure limits. But from the data that there is right now, we do know that there's a possibility that exposure to rare earth elements can contribute to all of the bodily systems that you see over here on the right. So they can cause disease of the respiratory system, the skin, reproductive system, blood, neurological, kidney, and liver. And in order to confirm or understand better how they affect these systems, we're going to need some more research done in this area. So I'm going to go into a little bit more about the toxicological characteristics of the rare earth elements, and that will allow us to better understand how they're toxic to the human body. So some characteristics are that they're very similar in terms of physical and chemical properties. There is no known biological role of rare earth elements in humans. Their soluble forms are chlorides, nitrates, and sulfates, and their insoluble forms are carbonates, phosphates, and hydroxides. And we know that solubility increases with increasing atomic number, which might be important in determining toxicity of light versus heavy rare earth elements. In rock-forming minerals, so whenever we're mining, typically they occur as trivalent cations and carbonates, oxides, phosphates, and silicates. So some of the insoluble forms. We know that light rare earth elements mainly deposit in the liver and are excreted in the feces, and heavy rare earth elements mimic calcium and deposit in the bone and are excreted in the urine. So those are some of the things that we know from the current research. And here are some more. There's some animal lethality data, or LD50, and we know that it's similar for all of the rare earth elements. So you can see some of the data from mice and rats down at the bottom, and based on these numbers, it's classified as moderately toxic. There has been 2 rare earth elements that show evidence of mutagenicity, but overall, there's insufficient evidence to classify any of them as a carcinogen, and that's because the evidence for mutagenicity have just been from cellular studies and animal studies, no epidemiological studies. So I'm going to go into some of the health effects that have been found in research for the respiratory system and the skin. And that's because those are the 2 that are likely the most important for occupational exposure based on what we know at the moment. So first off, the respiratory system. We know that inhalation is the primary route of occupational exposure. We know that the rare earth elements are poorly absorbed in the lungs, so they don't contribute to a high systemic effect outside of the lungs. They normally stay there. Short-term exposure is associated with acute irritative bronchitis, or kind of like a chest cold. And then long-term exposure is associated with pneumocomiosis and progressive pulmonary fibrosis. So that means the damage and the scarring of the lungs. if exposed to rare earth elements long term. And for the skin effects, we know that rare earth elements are poorly absorbed through the skin, so again, localized damage to the skin, and that they are strong skin irritants, progressing from irritation to ulceration and granulomas after prolonged contact. And the longer period of contact causes more serious skin damage. So I thought this would be important, especially for processing whenever the rare earth elements become more highly concentrated. So less important whenever you're mining and you don't have that concentrate, but it could be cause skin damage. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the naturally occurring radioactive materials. And this is going to be a little bit more common knowledge, how norms affect the human body. So I won't spend a lot of time on it, but we know that the radioactive decay of uranium-238 and thorium-232 can cause chronic low-level exposures to ionizing radiation, and that ionizing radiation can cause cancer. And we also know that there's 4 exposure pathways that ionizing radiation from the decay of uranium and thorium can cause cancer. And the first one is the exposure to direct external gamma radiation. The second one is the inhalation of radon and thoron and their radioactive progeny. So this is where rare earth element mining and processing becomes a little bit more unique, especially as it relates to what the industry looks like in Canada right now. So there is, as you'll see on the next slide, significant uranium and thorium content, and so thoron is the radioactive gas that comes from the decay of thorium, and that's not really a hazard at the moment right now in the Canadian industry and uranium mining and other types of mining. So this is a new hazard that needs to be measured and quantified and the risk assessed. And so number 3 is the inhalation of airborne long-lived radioactive dust. And number 4 is the ingestion of radioactive material. So those 4 are all the 4 different ways that that the decay of uranium and thorium can affect the human body through ionizing radiation. And this gives you an idea of what the thorium and uranium content is in at least Canadian rare earth element deposits. So this comes from 19 Canadian mineral deposits. So you can see that thorium and uranium are elevated. Thorium ranges from 12 to 762 ppm with an average of 326 ppm. And uranium oxide is from 4 to 400, the range, and the average is 89 parts per million. So the takeaway from here is that actually there's a higher concentration of thorium in the rare earth element ore than uranium. And so thorium is a real hazard in rare earth element mining and processing as a byproduct or contaminant. And just to give you an idea, in Canada, substances are regulated based on the radioactivity of the substance. If it contains around 20 to 30 ppm of thorium or uranium. So these levels can be quite a bit higher than that, and on average are higher than that. And that's the unrestricted level. So there needs to be, controls in place to mitigate the risk at these levels. Okay, on to the next section, legislation and guidance. And this is a picture of some of the rare earth element mineralogy in Quebec. So I'm going to touch on rare earth elements at first here. And as you might be able to gather, because of the lack of research on rare earth element health effects and toxicity, it translates into a lack of legislation and guidance. And so of those 17 elements on the periodic table that are classified as rare earths, there's actually only one that has a published limit. And this is globally. as we know. So this will apply to the UK as well. And so it's yttrium that has a known regulatory or guidance occupational exposure limit. And the limit is a full shift time-weighted average of 1 milligram per meter cubed of airborne concentration of dust. So, and this limit for workers to be exposed to is designed to protect against pulmonary fibrosis, so the damage of the scarring of the lungs. And based on the documentation of this published limit, this is mainly made from animal studies of exposing rats to yttrium in a laboratory. The documentation also cites that the toxicity data in the industrial reports are limited, and there is insufficient data to recommend if yttrium absorbs through the skin, if skin is a major pathway for yttrium to enter the body, whether it's also insufficient, there's insufficient data to tell whether or not it's a sensitizer, which means that whether or not it contributes to like an allergic reaction, or if it's carcinogenic to humans. So although we do have a limit for yttrium, it is based on not a lot of research. Okay, so if there's only one occupational exposure limit and we're interested to know how all of those other rare earth elements affect the human body, it poses a little bit of a problem for people to assess the risks. So people might be tempted to use what we call the nuisance dust or particulates not otherwise specified, or PNOS limits. And I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this, but essentially it's a limit for non-soluble, relatively non-toxic dust. And the limits are 3 milligrams per meter cubed and 10 milligrams per meter cubed for respirable dust and inhalable dust. And these two different limits are different size fractions, so it really depends on where the substance acts upon the respiratory system. So for respirable dust, these are the smaller bits of dust that deposit lower in the respiratory tract, and then the inhalable dust can deposit anywhere within the respiratory tract, and the size fraction is larger. And so in occupational hygiene, you'll see whether or not what the fraction size is and which fraction size is associated with which harmful substance. So for example, yttrium is associated with deposition everywhere in the respiratory tract. So it's an inhalable dust limit. So we can see that nuisance dust limits are not appropriate for assessing risk to rare earth elements, because based on the toxicity, they are moderately toxic, not relatively non-toxic. And you can see here that the yttrium limit of 1 milligram per meter cubed is actually only 1/10 of the nuisance dust limit of 10 milligrams per meter cubed. So we should be avoiding using this limit for assessing risk to rare earth elements, is the takeaway here. So NIOSH, which is an American health agency, was faced with the same problem back in 1989. And so this is just an example of what another health agency has done in the absence of limits for rare earth elements. So they were doing a health hazard evaluation to determine what the risk was to exposure to metal powders during manufacture of magnetic products in a facility in the United States. And 2 rare earth element powders, neodymium and dysprosium, were being used. And because NIOSH knew that they exhibit similar chemical and toxicological properties, and then they assumed subsequently they had similar health effects, they used the yttrium exposure criteria of 1 milligram per meter cubed for both neodymium and dysprosium. So based on all the literature that I've showed you so far about rare earth elements, WSP Golder came up with a guidance value. This is not a value that was published anywhere. It's just one that we use for our clients. and it will be, reviewed ongoing based on new research that comes out. But this is the best that we could do so far, and so I wanted to show you what it was and show you how we got there, what assumptions we used. And so what we call the WSP Gold derived guidance value for total amount of rare earth elements is 1 milligram per meter cubed of inhalable dust. And so we took the yttrium level that has been published, and we applied that to the total amount of our REEs, so like all of the 17 elements put together. And so our assumptions were that rare earth elements are all of similar toxicity to yttrium, that rare earth elements act upon the same target organ, which is the lungs, and that this toxic site of action for our rare earth elements is the inhalable region of the lung. So we didn't use the respirable size fraction, we used the inhalable size fraction, the same as the yttrium limit, and that the health effects are additive and not synergistic or multiplicative. So this is the one that we came up with to assess risk. This is the best we could do with the research available to us, but I'm hoping that there is published limits by organizations who publish health-based limits sometime in the near future, and that they're brought into legislation. But so far, this is what we've been using to assess risk. Okay, now the legislation and guidance on norms, and so this is going to be more geared towards Canada. So I apologize in advance, but I think that probably it can be, or some lessons can be learned from Canada and applied to the UK. So the worker dose limits for norms, the International Atomic Energy Agency, or the IAEA, sets limits that ultimately get adopted by different countries around the world, including Canada's nuclear industry. And so you'll see these dose limits of 20 millisieverts per year averaged over 5 consecutive years, and 50 millisieverts per year in every single year. You'll see that come up in legislation around the world. And you'll also see what's called the ALARA principle, or as low as reasonably achievable. And this is applied heavily to the nuclear fuel cycle industry because of ionizing radiation from uranium. And it's also applied to carcinogens. And so it's that all radiation doses or carcinogens should be maintained as low as reasonably achievable, or ALARA, with social and economic factors taken into account. So you might be familiar with that principle already. So for Canada, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, they apply these IAEA levels to their nuclear fuel cycle industry. So it only applies in Canada to rare earth element mining if uranium or thorium is sold as a byproduct that will then become part of the nuclear fuel cycle. But that's not the case, actually. So the rare earth element mining and processing is not under the CNSC, or the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And then the other gap that can be found in Canada and might also be in the UK is that Canadian uranium mines don't have a substantial quantity of thorium. So actually the legislation and guidance doesn't address the thorium decay chain and only the uranium decay chain. So there might be a few things that are missed in there in terms of assessment of thorium. And so the rare earth element mining and processing in Canada, which is certainly still in its infancy, is not regulated under our Nuclear Safety Commission, but provincially and territorially. And the worker radiation dose limits are out of date, and they don't adequately address the risks that come from the decay of uranium and thorium. And so in Canada, we have what's called the Health Canada Norm Guidelines, and this is more detailed than the mining regulations. And so we've been using this to assess risk in the absence of adequate legislation and guidance in Canada. Okay, so I want to quickly leave you with a few future considerations as it relates to worker health in this emerging industry. So workplace diseases and injuries were responsible for almost 2 million deaths in 2016, and this was done by the World Health Organization and the International Labour Organization. So workplace disease and injuries do have a really high global burden. And this is something that surprises some people, is that over 80% of these deaths are from occupational diseases, whereas only 19% are from acute injuries. And it's a trend, or it's just I guess it makes sense that acute injuries garner more attention. You know, they're more visible. Occupational diseases might take up to 40 years to develop after people are exposed. So a lot more attention gets placed on acute injuries in industry. However, the greatest causes of death are actually from respiratory diseases, and so rare earth elements and inhaling norms from the rare earth element mining industry can fall into that category. So it's something that deserves attention for sure. And a few other points is that this is an emerging industry. You know, we don't have all the answers right now, but we need to be thinking about how we can assess the risk with what we have. And so there needs to be more guidance and research on rare earth element toxicity, and to develop occupational exposure limits that, you know, that are published and health-based. And also we need them to make it into legislation, because we know that that's sometimes what drives these assessments and protection for workers. We need to assess the risk with the information that we have. So we can quantify the rare earth elements. You can, you know, take a personal sample for a worker. You can send the sample away and get it analyzed for each of those 17 elements. And so you can see exactly how much people are breathing in a work shift. And so we can do that right now. And that data is going to be increasingly valuable as we come to create and develop these occupational exposure limits. As for norms, we need to address both the uranium and thorium decay chains when we're assessing risk to norms. And I think probably globally, thorium is missing from legislation and guidance. And there's a lack of regulatory limits and guidance for assessing norms, specifically thorium. So we need to adopt a strategy for assessment and control. And then finally, I want to leave you with a happy point. And this is that radiation protection and dust management practices are well known in the mining and mining processing industries. So once we assess the risk as best we can use these same management practices to protect workers whenever they're working in this new emerging rare earth element industry. So that's all from me. I will put up my references for a second. This is some of the literature that was reviewed to come up with this information in the presentation. And